think we are going. Cool. Hey, James, welcome back to the Futures Fanatic channel. Lots have changed since we last spoke 3 years ago, but welcome back to the Futures Fanatic channel. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me. A lot has changed in the last 3 years. You're right.
Yeah, so I will have said in the intro that we first spoke, I think in like May or April, right around now in 2022, when you had recently launched Tradeday. So for those that might not be familiar, and most of my audience knows most of the OGs in the space, maybe tell us a little bit about Tradeday and yourself and your background, just to familiarize the audience.
Sure, I'll try and keep it brief. You know, I've got a long history, but my co-founder and I, Steve, we're from what I would call the sort of like the professional side. We were both Well, I was a trader in London in the 1990s. He was a broker for Merrill Lynch. And then he went on to run research, technical analysis research at Merrill Lynch and Credit Suisse. And I was a trader from 94 through to 2009. I worked for an exchange for 18 months and then went on to manage professional trading groups up until 2020. I founded Tradeday with Steve in 2020. You know, everyone's familiar with trader evaluation services or online prop firms now. Back then they weren't so much, but the idea was that we would try and crowdsource a trading group by putting traders through an evaluation and try and identify, you know, trading talent out there around the world and eventually back them with real capital in the live markets with the view to growing a professional trading group. And that was the mission at the outset. Things, you know, have evolved since then. The space has evolved. It's very busy. It's become hyper competitive, but essentially that was it. Tradeday is an old man of the industry. With the company was formed in 2020, but launched late 21 and funding our first traders by February 2022. And I have, you know, I'm losing track now. I started trading in 94, but I joined the industry in 1990. So 36 years of experience in futures.
Yeah, I love it. Well, that's great. So one of the things that when we first spoke, it was that you guys launched in a much different way than some of the competitors at the time, which was you were the original, hey, straight to funding organization, right? Where you didn't offer a lot of accounts, and as soon as someone passed an evaluation, you put them in a live market. We're here to talk a little bit about Tradeday 2.0. So maybe you can tell us what you sort of learned over the last couple of years, why, I don't know if you think if you can't beat them, you've joined them or whatever, but it seems like it's a great blend. So what's really changed and what have you learned since back then? And then we'll get into what Tradeday 2.0 is all about.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, there was an evolution from when we first spoke to 2.0, but you're right. When we very first set out, I mean, we were a 15-day evaluation, which is, you know, and then straight to funded live, which, you know, is actually, when you're putting people in funded live, incredibly short for an evaluation, despite what, you know, the community might say today. But that was our model. You know, we were more expensive. We had 2 accounts, and really, we just evolved based on the lack of success that we were seeing on the live side and the demand from the trader. People didn't like that first step. I think there's a number of reasons for that. Some of them are structural. You know, you might increase more slippage depending on your strategy in the live market. But I think the biggest hurdle for a lot of traders is the psychological impact from going from a simulated account where there's not really real money at risk to going to a live account where it's live. And that big psychological hurdle causes a fall off in performance. So a lot of traders were pushing us to put them into a funded sim account because, you know, first of all, the setup process is much quicker. And second of all, that sort of graduation from an evaluation into a demo account that carries more pressure because there is a payout, a pressure and obligation, you know, like a pressure created by being in a payout situation. It's still less pressure than being in a live market. So that was really, we responded to what the customer wanted. And then, you know, we would constantly get feedback, your evaluations are too long, they're too long. So, you know, we had to manage our risk as a firm by putting the you know, nearly all the traders into sim as a middle step. Because, you know, everybody knows that most people end up blowing those sim accounts anyway before they gain any traction.
Yeah. So it sounds like it was less a reaction to competitive pressures, or maybe a reaction to what your customers and traders were saying relative to other products and offerings that they saw out there. And really, it's the best of both worlds, right? I think when we originally talked, I said maybe you will eventually find that a hybrid is the best approach, right? Where
Yes.
and then a very small amount of people still have an opportunity to get to that stage. So let me ask you this. I'm seeing on your website, and we'll take a look at Tradeday 2.0 in just a moment. A lot of large payout certificates. Do you know what percentage of those are in large live markets or in simulated markets? Because people are very concerned when they see big payouts in sim that firms can't really afford that.
Yeah, you know what's interesting about that is that we have a team of people that put that together, and I was signing off on it before we went to launch, and as part of that process, of sort of like designing it. But Steve and I's input was very much sort of light touch. And as we were going into launch, I was looking at the payout certificates, and I'm like, wow, they've really selected our some of our highest payouts, and we should probably put some lower payouts up there because it looks like it's not genuine. But no, they're all genuine payouts. They're not representative of our average payout. And I'm asking the team, to pull up some more certificates. And actually what we're going to do is we're going to make that dynamic. So it's populating with live payouts, or like once a week sampling at random the week's payouts. Whereas right now they're just examples of what we've had in the past. And I think that the team were like, let's put some big ones up there because it'll look better. Can we afford those payouts? Well, the short answer is yes. We've been here 5 years. We do, I think, a pretty good job of managing our risk. Some of those payouts I know for a fact came from the live markets. And obviously once the traders in the live markets, the risk to trade day is massively reduced. You still have risk because you have things like slippage, when that account's auto liquidating. You could have a technology issue where that trader's left with an open position and they can't get out of it for whatever reason. So there is a minor risk, but essentially you are aligned with the trader. The more money they make, the more the more you want them to make, and the better it is for both parties. So our goal is to really get good traders, consistent sort of funded sim traders into that space, and then we can kind of let them go. We're not concerned about, like, as I said, like that sort of payout risk that you have when you're in funded sim, and your incentives aren't aligned.
Good. Well, I encourage that. Get back with your marketing team, and since I'm the futures fanatic, and we're all about micros make money over here, and we try to use leverage properly. If we could see some more reasonable ones, because there's a high chance now. No shade to any of them that accomplish that. It's amazing when you can do that in demo, but it was probably done with minis and a decent amount of leverage. So yeah, if you could grab some of the smaller, more representative, that would be great, because I think there's probably a lot in your community that are doing that. But back to, do you have any sense of whether if those are live or sim, or does it say on the certificate? I didn't really look.
It doesn't say on the certificate live or sim.
Gotcha. Okay.
We could probably put that in. It actually it brings up you make a good point. That's a good segue into one of our changes. And today with our new quick pay accounts, there's actually no buffer to clear. So you make it, you can take it. Now there is, a fairly significant profit share under a certain amount. I think it's $4,000. It's a 50-50 split. But I have full expectation that some traders, particularly those trading multiple accounts, as soon as they get in profit, might take some of that a profit off the table, maybe to recover the investment in the evaluation. So I actually expect to see a lot more lower payouts actually on our platform, because I think we are literally the only prop firm in the space. And I might even put my neck out and say, I know we're the only futures prop firm, but we might be the only prop firm in crypto and in CFDs. I don't know too much, but I suspect we might be one of them that allows traders to do that. Of course, we have competitors today in futures that will claim they have day one payouts, and they do if you clear the buffer. You know,
Right.
and
Yeah.
to clear the buffer on day one is not necessarily that easy, particularly if your approach is sensible and you're looking to generate risk-adjusted returns. It might take you a few days to get above that buffer before you qualify for a payout. But our quick pays today, you make it, you can take it.
Yeah, and I think that's very unique. And you had mentioned a significant profit split. I think it's very reasonable for what you're offering. So we'll put this up on the screen to go into a little bit more details. But on those quick pays, there's no buffer or hurdle to clear. I think there is a minimum amount, right? Is 150
Yeah,
bucks or $250?
250 is our minimum
Yeah,
withdrawal.
$250, but that doesn't really eat into your drawdown, and it's 50-50 until such time as you have taken out 4,000, which for the benefit of not having to do the evaluation again, essentially, this is what was so silly about a lot of these direct funding and all these things, especially with very tight consistency rules, is like you almost had to do evaluations twice, even if
Yes.
you bought something that was a direct to funded account, right? I mean,
Yes, yeah,
you're
absolutely.
still doing the same thing, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So,
I think the
yeah.
you know, we've never offered that model, and it's not. I'm not
Right.
saying we won't do it in the future, but I think that had a hot moment, 18 months
Yeah.
ago, whatever it was, and I think the one of the first to bring it to market ended up blowing up.
Well, it's in spectacular fashion. Those were
in
quality
spectacular
gentlemen.
fashion, but
Yeah.
it was kind of like, I think it was the hot thing because people didn't realize that, essentially you're just pushing the evaluation onto the second part. And,
Right.
it's more about marketing, and it's a very high ticket item for most companies. Obviously, if it's competitively priced, then, the restrictions around, getting into a position where you can request a payout are so high that, almost it's not worth it at all. But I've spoken to a few traders about it, and they kind of like a little bit turned off by it today. But I'm not saying we would never do it, but it's just, I think it had its moment in the sun, and people realize what it is.
Not only that, I mean, I think that now the pricing has come down. You're doing something very competitive right now. As the time we're recording this, I'll get it out very quickly. You're running a 50% discount, and you guys were not a deep discounting firm. And many of the programs also include the activation fee. You can select an intraday or end of day. So very competitive. I don't know if you wanted to add anything that I might be missing in what you're launching here in 2.0, but
yeah, I think one thing I would like to, a couple of things actually I'd like to address. The first is, I think we were getting a reputation for being the expensive platform for, like super experienced traders. And, our goal with Tradeday was to get away from that and use a sort of like a term that's thrown around, democratize, like finance access or whatever. We were keen to try and just make things a bit more competitive for us and open up our services and how we do things to a wider proportion of the community. And to do that, we needed to bring the price down. But obviously, when you bring the price down, you have to put more restrictions on the payout side. So we have changed a few things. We were known in the space, for those that did know us, of having an end of day evaluation with an end of day funded sim drawdown when you move into the funded stage. Some of our competitors who are, I'll acknowledge are bigger than us, had a similar evaluation, but switched to intraday on funded. And we decided to follow that model because of feedback that we had with people from traders. Were like, I don't care, because once the trading maximum drawdown gets to the starting account balance, it freezes, and it means that I can get that evaluation cheaper. So we did make that switch, and I'd like to make that clear today in case people still think of Tradeday as end of day. Now we do have, we have like what we call two policies or two programs. The first is our quick pay, which looks a lot like our older valuations. It's a 5-day valuation, 30% consistency, but that's the one where you make it, you can start to take it. And those are either an intraday evaluation, intraday funded, or end of day evaluation, making it a little easier to pass, but again, intraday when funded. If you want to go to an end of day evaluation, end of day funded, you have to move to our new fast pass. And those programs look a lot like what a lot of the industry has today, like the flex accounts or the flex pays, flex payout policies, where you have to trade for once you're funded, you have to trade for a minimum number of days before qualifying for a payout. You're capped on that payout. So we introduced those again for feedback from other traders who I suspect were looking to add extra accounts to their trade copiers, and we're hoping that we can be part of that journey with them. So we've added those too. And then the other thing we wanted to do was, it seems to be a lot of ambiguity in the space around when people move to funded live, how they move to funded live. There seems to be a little bit of rug pulling there, people having accounts taken away. And listen, I understand why prop firms do this. The days of fat margins are gone. Margins are very, very tight at prop firms now because of the hyper competition. And, you're trying to manage your risk all along and make sure you're bringing in more than you're paying out. But what we thought was important was to have a very clear path to funded live. So we have that. They're two slightly different paths depending on whether you're on fast pass or quick pay, but are explained on our site. But they're transparent so people can see, okay, I know when I'm going to get called up to funded live, but I know what that looks like.
Well, that's great, because that has been definitely controversies recently where people are even trying to game it a little bit and not take enough payouts and not show up on the radar so that they stay in that environment. So that's great. So I imagine the details of that, like you said, are on the website. How about the flip side, which is always a concern, which would be payout denials, which a very small percentage of the market will say that this is an issue, and generally when you look into it, they deserved what they got most of the time.
Yes.
But I mean, how do you view that, and do you think there are any valid payout denial concerns within the industry where firms are really actually skirting around what their obligations are?
Yeah, I do think that happens. I do think that happens. And I think it's a function of, so I think on this journey, I've gone through a maturing process myself. I used to kind of revel in watching firms, change rules, retroactively fit them, do mass payout denials, and and not sort of like revel at the trader's problem, but the firm's problem, right? But now I understand what's going on a lot more. That those firms are in trouble, or they're having to make these changes. They're being forced to make these changes quickly, or they're being targeted. Because that's happened. That's been a relatively new thing for Tradeday. In 2025, we started to get targeted by we can talk more on who I think those people are and what they're doing in a moment. But ultimately, this business, as I'm sure is no surprise to most people, it works like an insurance business or a state lottery or a casino. Okay, you sell a product, you bring in revenue, and out of that revenue, you make payouts. And you need to have that balance correct. You need to be bringing in more than you're paying out. And if you have that balance incorrect, you're obviously in trouble, you're underwater, you're losing money, and you're eventually blowing up. The challenge in prop firms is that it's a lead lag situation, in so much that you bring the revenue in and you're not immediately paying it out. Traders are going through an evaluation and then getting into a funded stage. Some of them might be blowing and coming back through. Ultimately, the payout obligation builds behind the revenue. And so when I see firms making payout denials, it usually is an indication to me that that they're in trouble, that they've got that wrong. If it's mass denials, individual denials, I completely sympathize and empathize with the firm, because we've experienced gaming and people, knowingly, deliberately trying to circumnavigate our prohibited trade practices, take advantage of the way that we're set up to try and game us, so to speak. Now, I don't have a problem if people approach Tradeday and think, okay, this is my strategy. It won't work in the live markets. It will work at Tradeday if it's in compliance with our prohibited trade practices. But one of our prohibited trade practices, for example, is hedging, sometimes known as
Yeah.
grid trading. So you have multiple accounts, you go long in one and short in the other. It's a strategy that doesn't work in the live market, so it's a prohibited trade practice at trade day. You know, when we moved to multiple accounts last year, that became a thing for us, and we had to spend a lot of time developing security applications to try and monitor that trading behavior. And you know,
real quick on this hedging thing, can we, because it's become such an issue and I answer it all the time, and it's also become bastardized a little bit because well, for just really quick background, right? So if you're not familiar, the CME and regulatory bodies at the exchanges actually like hedging in the purest sense, meaning one related product correlated versus another will actually give you span margin back. This issue of being long and short the same instrument was never really a thing because multiple sub accounts was not a thing. You didn't go to your broker and say, I would like 10 $5,000 accounts, please, right? You know, in fact,
but even if you did, it doesn't work, right? Because you go long in one and short in the other, you're making in one and losing in the other.
No, it doesn't work. But what has been a little confounding and is that there are many firms out there that still consider hedging being long the MES and short the MYM at any time, whether they were entered at the same time or whatever. So I haven't looked into your rules. Do you have the concept of correlated instruments, or is it only the same instrument, long and short, in two different accounts?
It's only the same instrument. You know, the firms that are doing that.
That's how it's supposed to work.
Yeah, the firms that are doing that, there's one or two things going on. One, well, there could be a number of things. They don't know what they're doing, and if they do know what they're doing, then then they're being, they're not being straight with you, and they're just using it as an excuse to offboard obligation. Because ultimately, if I open my brokerage account and I want to trade the divergence or convergence of the spread between the NQ and the ES, or the Dow and whatever index, that's a trade. That is that's a trade that I practice as a professional trader. That's trades that hedge funds practice. That's absolutely fine. And in fact, like you say, you actually get margin back from the exchange, because the trade's actually hedged. But going long one NQ in one account and short one NQ in another account, that's different. What you're trying to do there is, like, if I get stopped out, I lose the price of the evaluation. And if I make, and if I make money, I get $2,000-3,000 payout or whatever. That's completely different. So, at Trade Day, we definitely, understand strategy and understand risk, and we don't punish people for being long, one related product against another.
Great. The funny thing was always that concept of related or correlated. I'm like, where are these correlations that you're talking about, and how often do they hold up, right? So,
and I just want to be, and sorry, just to be clear on one thing, because I don't want to get called out on this. If you're long one NQ and short two MNQ, it's the same thing as being long one NQ and short one NQ. We're not born yesterday. We know what you're doing. So, we don't allow that. But ultimately, one E-mini against one S&P against one Nasdaq. I mean, that's a strategy, right? You're trying to play for play for convergence.
And for right now, and I don't want to speak for you, I'll just ask the question. I imagine when someone actually gets into fully live markets, then they can do whatever they want within exchange policies and basically your overlay of your policies. As an example, there's also strategies in which you can have a mini versus a micro. Now, whether you can do that at Trade Day or any place, you don't need to be doing that when you're going through these evaluations in small accounts. But as you grow as a trader, that is also a slight benefit, because basically then you can either hedge or take off a portion of your mini by using micros, right? It's the same thing as a covered call, essentially, is what it is, or a cash secured put. Absolutely. Cool. Just as a quick aside, when I was preparing for this interview, I was like, Trade Day, what a cool name. And then you guys got that. Can you tell me a little bit about how you got that URL? I mean, in this world where so many of these firms have the word funding in their title, which they shouldn't, because it's a blurry line about how much funding is actually going on. I joke sometimes that most traders are funding the prop firms. It's not the other way around. So anyway, how did Trade Day, the URL, come into existence, and how did you guys get that?
Yeah, so 2020, we were forming the company and doing all the exciting things about thinking about brand and and name and things. And I was working with a friend of mine, Chris, at the time, and I kind of had pretty much felt like I had like one or two like must-haves. I wanted a .com, URL, not a .co, you know, and I wanted, if possible, a single word. And what would be really nice to have is something trading related, you know. And I'm going to give Chris props here; he came up with this name. But of course, when we went to register it, it was taken, you know. And I don't think it's possible to register a single word .com now. You know, they're all taken. And Cyber Squat and so yeah, so I registered. So we found the person that owned Tradeday. You know, we liked the name, and it was somebody who bought it in 2000. I think it's 2004 out of San Francisco. A guy that owned a pizza place, and I guess it was a thing back then. You know, people were buying up names and sitting on them. You know, and we contacted him to see if it was for sale. Of course, it was for sale, and it was actually a pretty reasonable price. It was, I think he wanted either $5,000 or $5,500, maybe $6,000 at the time, and I think we negotiated him down to $5,500. And then, but what was really great, you know, we were a startup and we were, you know, bootstrapping, and so what was really great is he agreed to lease it to us at $100 a month, and literally paying down the principal at $100 a month as well. And then after a year, once we'd launched, you know, we thought, well, we should probably own this URL rather than lease it, and paid off the balance. But yeah, we were really lucky. You know, I mean, you couldn't get a name like that today. You know, things, you know, I mean, 2020 it was hard enough, but 2026 it'd be impossible. You know, or you could get it, but you know, the cost would be really, really high.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. Well, it's a great name, and I'm glad that the investment that you were making over that time became kind of a no-brainer at this point, because it's a great brand that you guys can build on now, which is fantastic.
Thank you.
All right, so real quick, back to the Tradeday 2.0. Is there anything that we kind of haven't covered at a high level, or anything that you wanted my audience to know? Because again, I will have mentioned in the intro that I want a lot of my audience to come back to find some of these original firms that have been doing it right the whole time, and revisit them, especially now that you have this very compelling price going on. So anything that we missed so far that you thought should be highlighted?
No, I think, you know, we basically covered it. We have two types of programs. We have the quick pay, which, you know, essentially is the quickest route to being paid, and we have the fast pass, which is the fastest route to passing. You know, that's a 45% consistency on the evaluation. There's no additional minimum days, but of course you can't pass a 45% consistency in less than 3 days. But on the quick pays, there is an additional sort of 5 days to pass. You know, there's the 30% consistency and 5 days. So you know, those are the two programs. They both have their own payout policies, and they both have their own routes to funded lives. So make sure you read through the FAQs, figure out which one's right for you. The goal for us, Tradeday, as I mentioned earlier, was to try and bring in some evaluations at very competitive price points. And you know, so, you know, we've had a little bit of feedback, you know, not so positive on the split for the quick pays is 50-50 up to 4,000. And, you know, but we need to, as we mentioned, you know, we need to design a payout policy that makes sense to us, that allows us to bring in, you know, a instant 1-day payout evaluation at the price point we have.
Yeah, and we already talked about there's no the trade-off there is there's no buffer. There's no buffer that you have to hit, right? So there's a smaller split, but you can take out some money right away, and that's not totally incongruous with some other competitors out there that have a buffer and then a split that's a little bigger for quite a while. So I think it's a good mixture. All right, so we're here talking about Tradeday 2.0. Based on everything you're seeing, what do you think will be in 3.0 in a little while from now? Or where's this industry? Where's this industry going, and where is Tradeday going? And I just before we got on to record this, I was listening to the CEO of the CME make some really, and look, I'm not apologetic for the CME at all. I think they're a Gestapo, and they should have lower data fees, and we need competition. That being said, competition coming from these prediction markets that are completely unregulated and are now having perpetual futures contracts that are somehow going to have forward and backward carrying costs associated with them. Where's the whole industry going, both prop and, you think, just generally active trading?
Yeah. I mean, you know, in terms of like the broader asset classes and the different, you know, like prediction markets, so we call it an asset class, and perpetuals, you know, I don't really have, I'm obviously watching the space closely, but my answer would be in the context of prop. And what I feel is that we will see more prop firms start to build evaluation services around prediction markets in particular. Perpetual futures are kind of more, I don't really have much of an opinion on that. In terms of the industry, I would say, and let's start like this way. Let's start on a micro level, right? On a user and a trader level, because that's where I think that your audience will be really interested. I think we're going to see, first of all, because it's hyper competitive, this business, and some of it somewhat becoming commoditized, firms are going to be forced to differentiate themselves a little bit, and that's going to, I think, manifest itself in offering different services and different features to the user. And and I think firms need to get creative on what value add they bring outside of the evaluation. Tradeday, we have a morning meeting, we have daily technical analysis research that's put together by Steve and his team at the Market Chartist. We have a daily we have a Squawk commentary service that banks and hedge funds listen to for breaking news. So that's kind of like, that was the route that we took, and we want to do more of that. And then I think for the user, there's going to be sort of like what I call more optionality presented throughout the journey. So maybe at checkout, we're starting to see things like you can buy a bigger percentage split, like an upsell, if you like, more in-app purchases, things that will like, as I said, just give more options to the user. And we saw it a couple of years ago where there was the trend to, instead of purchasing a reset on the eval, you can purchase a reset on the funded account. That's what I call like an in-app sort of purchase. And I think we'll see more of that, and it'll be quite creative. I also think that from a firm and from a user experience, we might start to, and as the industry matures, we might start to see dynamic risk controls on contracts. And what I mean by that is, we all lived through the gold or the precious metals bull run at the end of last year. And actually some firms, I believe, that went under at that time were victim to excessive SIM payouts that were generated through, like, I don't want to say the ease of trading those markets, but they, let's face it, they were a little, more trader friendly. And, and it certainly caused an increase in payout pressure at Tradeday, nothing we couldn't handle, but we saw it, and we know other firms had it, and anybody that was trading in this space would only have to be on X to sort of see like firms changing different policies from one week to the next. And if you think about how, a wheat versus an oil versus an NQ versus an ES versus a British pound against US dollar contract, those volatilities are very different across the contracts, and those volatilities change depending on what's happening in the news cycle. And so when you think about what we do at the moment, what the industry does, what it tends to do is like, hey, you can trade 5 contracts on a 50K. And when you get funded, you can trade 5 contracts on a 50K, regardless of the product. It doesn't really make any sense. And from the prop firm point of view, when we put those traders in live, there's a bigger requirement on margin on the more highly volatile products. So I think what we might see is, and I think we're starting to see it a little bit, is more dynamic risk. So, if you want to trade NQ, you're going to be given smaller position limits than you would if you wanted to trade ES, for example.
Amen. Let's do it. I mean, this could be a gradual, like I've said forever, that these programs have, and your firm and everybody that's providing this service, it is amazing teaching and education tool. Where it fails a lot of traders is the fact that it doesn't introduce them to true margin, and it doesn't introduce them to true sizing and risk constraints that are part of live markets. So that is part of the reason probably that there was such an abrupt shock when people were taken from that sim environment to live markets, and sometimes their buying power was pulled back and things like that. So man, I would love if firms could come up with, I don't know if we'll ever get to getting rid of notional value, like we've joked about, right? Because the market just doesn't want. I'm not paying you $85 for $1,000, dude. I'm going to pay you $85 for $50,000. But no, I like that concept of dynamic, where depending on the product that you're trading, your buying power is adjusted a little bit to somewhat reflect reality. So those that are unaware, right now, if you wanted to trade one NQ contract in a live market, you would have to have $30,000,
Right.
not 2,000,
Yeah, it's
30,000
crazy.
to meet.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
you qualify on a 150K account, and someone's going to give you 15 of those.
right,
Yeah.
exactly. In your $4,500 account, essentially, and that's 4,500 to blow the entire account, to lose
Yeah.
your entire investment, right? So
Yeah, so I think we'll see that, and I say
yeah,
we are starting to see it because I know some programs, are switching when you're in the funded account, reducing the position limits. So we are starting to see that. I think those are the things that are going to happen from a trader perspective. I think on a firm level, you're going to see a continued increase in platform security and enforcement of rules. The industry has, or the community has matured and grown in the last few years and become more savvy, and with that has brought its own challenges and subset of users that are out just basically to screw the prop firm, and so I feel for the regular trader that's here to use the prop firm as it's intended.
yeah,
When new rules get foisted on them, it's because of a small minority of people manage. So I think we'll see that. I think we'll see a diversification of what I would call revenue adjacent services. So, you're a prop firm, you might want to become a broker. We saw that Top Step were really the first to do that, but other firms are starting to follow that way. And third party service providers are facilitating that a lot easier and making that a lot easier for firms that want to take that direction. And then the other thing is, like, the prop firm themselves diversifying asset classes. So we talked about prediction markets. I actually have a piece of breaking news that is an inside scoop for you, Rod. Nobody outside of Tradeday knows this, but within the next 10 days, Tradeday is going to launch a crypto evaluation service.
oh,
So
fantastic.
so that's coming soon. Frontline prop, talking of URLs that we couldn't get just Frontline, so it's Frontline prop, but that's going to be like the next 10 days. I think you'll see that across. I know other firms are offering equities, single stock equities, and there has been a lot of interest in crypto, launching crypto based on Kraken's acquisition of Breakout last year. So we'll see that too. And then, like, as a very high level on the industry, we might see some consolidation, like firms buying other firms. Again, we've seen a little bit of that. Regulation's a question that keeps coming up and down, and I think that wind may ebb and flow with the current administration in the United States. I can only talk to, we're a US-based LLC, so I can only talk to what potentially would regulate us, not regulators globally.
I think we're fine during this administration.
I think we're fine during this administration. And to be fair to the regulators, what we do is a speck compared to the growth that they're trying to handle with prediction markets. So they've got their hands full elsewhere at the moment. So I don't really have much of an opinion. I've kind of, I think there was a higher chance of regulation 18 months ago than there is today. But I think ultimately it will come. The industry will mature and it will come. And then, and I think, we see a lot of third-party service providers popping up now that are creating services, especially for prop firms. So, we have like security applications and trader analytics tools for figure out what's going on in your platform. Like there are actually companies that are just do that now and come and offer their services to you. And that's it, really. I think, in terms of like getting the industry new entrants, there's a dual tension here. One is the barriers to entry for new prop firms have come down, particularly from a technical standpoint. Tradeday owns all its technology and built it from the ground up, but there are service providers out there. But the tension with that is that I think the capital barriers got higher. You could have started a prop firm 5 years ago, as we did, with 100 grand. There are a few service providers in the space who I've been tracking their thoughts on it. And sort of 3 years ago, they were, really, you need 200 grand. 2 years ago, they were like, you need 300 grand. And their latest publishing is, if you're going to do this, you need $1 million now. And, a lot of that comes down to, one, the margins are very thin because it's hyper competitive. So you've got to find a way to capture your audience and the customer acquisition. You know, we're all bidding on the same keywords and things at Meta and Google, and you know, customer acquisition cost has gone up. And it is hard, like, for new entrants, even though, you know, ironically, it hasn't been easier to set up a prop firm. And I think that speaks to why we see a lot of new firms blow up, because they come in and they're like, okay, they're undercapitalized, and I think, what can I do to gain traction? Well, I can either make it easier or I can sell it cheaper. And they get that balance that we talked about earlier of, you know, not bringing in enough revenue to cover the payout obligation.
Yeah. Well, that's to bring it full circle. That's why I wanted to have you on, which is that, you know, since my channel has grown, when we first spoke, I think I had 5,000 subscribers and now have 50. And
That's
you've
crazy.
gotten from where you were to Tradeday 2.0. And I get approached all the time by all these different firms, and I've kind of backed away a lot. That's a new figure to me. I didn't know the amount of capital that was required. I used to use the benchmark, like, do they have a relationship with Ninja or Tradeday or not? Because that's a high bar to clear. And many of these, many of these new ones don't. They're using DX Feed or some other platforms, which are fine. But anyway, to bring it full circle, I just want my audience to know, like, I don't do a lot of these interviews and I don't promote a lot of firms anymore. And I want, if you were unfamiliar with Tradeday, or in the past, as James has said, you thought they were too expensive, let's revisit it, because you have a rock solid professional organization that you can feel comfortable trading with. And while you can try out a lot of those others, and why I might mention some in the future if they clear some hurdles that I need them to clear, I think, unlike James, you were being pretty, I think, pretty forgiving of what's probably happening. I think there's going to be, in the next couple of years, just a tsunami of failures, and they'll probably be roll up or roll out, right? Some will be rolled up in acquisitions, and then the others is just going to be and you don't want to get caught with all those firms. So check out what Tradeday 2.0 is doing here, because again, this is the way it was supposed to work from the beginning, and now you've made some adjustments to catch up and be very competitive. And I want everyone to be aware of what you guys are doing out there. So any final thoughts or things in closing that you'd like to mention on our 3-year anniversary? Let's not wait another 3 years. We'll try to get together.
No, I think, you know, it feels strange to say that, you know, we last spoke 3 years ago. We registered the company in 2020, started in 2021. So we're kind of like about 5 years in business, that we're like now old and mature.
Yeah, no, you're
like 5 years in the business, but
you're blue chip, baby. That's why I'm promoting you.
Yeah, blue chip. We really appreciate your support, Rod. You know, we try to run a professionalship, and you know, trying to give service our traders the best we can. We've done it, you know, in a sort of like a sensible, risk managed approach. You know, we may have foregone some growth that we could have experienced because of that, but that's fine. You know, it means that we're safe, and the traders, you know, can trust us, and we're still here, and we can lean on the fact that we've been around for 5 years now, you know, and it's a really good trust signal. So that's really good. You know, we are 50% off at the moment. Don't forget to use Rod's code. I don't even know what your code is, Rod. But
it's code TDG. It's code TDG. Yes.
Code TDG at checkout.
TDG. We'll put it on the screen here, and we'll put it down in the description down below.
Use Rod's code TDG at checkout, and keep an eye out for Frontline Prop that's launching in the next 10 days.
Yeah, speaking of that, maybe we can do a little teaser here. I'll do it on the intro, but I can get some giveaway accounts or something. We can launch that as well pretty soon. That'd be great. Yeah. Well, thanks, James. Thanks for joining me on somewhat short notice, and congratulations on this new release. I think it's going to really resonate. So thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
All right.